Hey there, I'm Bill and welcome to Project Build, where today we're making this really big desk tabletop from oak hardwood flooring. So I made this desk tabletop here for Brady for her birthday a while ago, and we both liked it so much that we decided we wanted to make another one and put it up in our loft area as a crafting desk. This loft measures just a tiny bit over 8 feet wide, so I'm going to make the tabletop exactly 8 feet and it'll fit perfectly in here. This is going to be a pretty simple build, but if you need to see dimension plans, like always, you can find those on my website, which is linked down in the video description, somewhere down there. Alright, let's make it! I started this project by cutting out a piece of 3/4 inch plywood for the base to 22.5 by 96 inches. Which is 1.5 inches longer than the base will end up being, and I'm leaving it long so I have room to trim it to size later. The final dimensions of this tabletop will be 2 feet by 8 feet, but you can totally modify this to be whatever dimensions you want, and the process is going to be pretty much the same. I laid out the first row of flooring on top of the plywood. It's a good idea to let the flooring acclimate to a climate controlled environment for 48 hours if you can before using it. The last piece in my first row is too long here, so I marked it and cut it off on the miter saw, and I'll use the leftover piece of that board to start a future row. I flipped the first board over and applied wood glue to the bottom of it. I don't know how necessary this actually is, but my thought was that it would help to solidify the whole top and keep the flooring from being able to expand and contract as much over time, and it's worked really well for the other one of these tabletops that I made. I flipped the board over, used a wooden block to align it with the front edge, and clamped it in position. I put 1¼ inch trim screws through the bottom of the plywood base into the front edge of the flooring to hold down that front edge. To attach to the back edge, I first pre-drilled 3 32nd inch holes about a foot apart and a few inches from each of the ends of the board at a roughly 45-degree angle through the corner at the top of the tongue, and then screwed it in place with the trim screws. Pre-drilling is very important here, as these screws will break the tongue off if you don't pre-drill. You'll want to drive the screw in below flush so the next row of flooring can't contact the head of the screw. The rest of the row installs the same as the first piece. Add wood glue, line it up with the front edge, screw from below into the front edge, and then pre-drill and screw from the tongue side to hold down the back edge. When installing the piece at the far end, I fortunately remembered that I was going to have to cut off about 1 inch or so from each end, so I returned to the first piece, drilled a new hole set back a few inches, and moved the screws over, both here at the top and the one underneath. It's really important to set all the screws at both ends in a few inches, so we don't hit them with the saw blade when we trim up the tabletop later. I started the second row with the piece I cut off of the last board on the first, and laid out the whole row, making sure to stagger the seams of the boards against the last few rows. Installing the second row is very similar to the first, still gluing all the boards down, but we only need to screw down the back edges of the boards as the tongue on the previous row goes in the groove on this row and holds it in place, hence the name tongue and groove flooring. And it's just repeating the same thing for the next 7 rows, which brings us just 1 row from the back of the tabletop. I ran into some problems while installing these rows that you're likely to encounter as well while doing this. You'll find that a lot of floorboards just aren't straight. With the normal flooring install, the sheer force of the pneumatic flooring nailer will pull the floorboard up against the previous row, but we don't have that luxury here. So to combat this, I used F-clamps to pull the flooring up tight against the previous row where it was needed. Another common problem is when a board is bowed up away from the plywood base. If this were near the end of the base, I'd be able to clamp it down, but it's not, so I addressed this by screwing through the bottom into the back edge of the board with a 1¼ inch washer head screw, and this pulls the board flat while I pre-drill and attach it with trim screws, and I simply remove the washer head screw when done, and the board stays in place. Moving on to the last row, I removed the tongue from the boards here to make the back edges of the boards a flat surface that we can attach trim to, and then I screwed it up into the back edge from underneath, just like I did with the first row. Now it was time to cut the tabletop to length. I started by trimming off about 1/2 inch in from the plywood base on one side, square with the front edge of the top. I'm using a finished blade on my circular saw to avoid tear out and to get a smooth edge on the flooring as I cross cut it. Then I flipped the tabletop around, measured to 94.5 inches so that with the 3/4 inch thick trim on each side it will be 96 inches long, and cut the other side. To make the trim for this top, I ripped strips of 3/4 inch red oak to 1.5 inches wide, and then took them to the miter saw and cut 45-degree corners for the long sides of the tabletop. I test fit these pieces and then applied wood glue to the back side. I clamped it flush with the top edge and shot 1.5 inch brads to hold the trim in place. So some of the brads didn't go in deep enough, so I used a hammer and a nail set to knock them in further. I later realized that my brad nailer was somehow set to its shallowest depth setting, and it took me much longer than it should have to figure that one out. There's a bit of an overhang on the back side here due to the flooring just being slightly wider than the 2.25 inches that it's supposed to be, so I only shot brads into the top half of the trim here. With the trim on the long edges done, I cut, glued, and then tacked on the short edges and put a few brads in the corners to hold those together. Now, it wasn't a problem with this tabletop, but when I made the first one a while ago, I had bowed boards for these end trim pieces here, and I needed to clamp them in place while the glue dried, but most clamps aren't 8 feet long, so to do this I used ratcheting straps with towels under the ends and the ratchets to protect the wood, and tighten them down in the long direction. You may have to attach 2 of them together if your tabletop is 8 feet like this one is, and it's just a quick tip if anyone happens to run into this problem. Once all the wood glue had dried, I filled all the nail holes and the corner seams on the trim, as well as any of the larger gaps that were present on the top between the flooring boards with wood filler, and how thorough you want to be here is totally up to you. I kinda wanted to get every possible gap, and I probably went overboard with the wood filler. I sanded the top with 60 grit sandpaper on my orbital sander, working in smooth, slow passes to smooth out any uneven edges between boards and knocking the wood filler down. For a tabletop this large, I really recommend using a belt sander, as this took a long time with my small orbital sander. I just don't have one yet, but in hindsight, I would totally get one. Once the surface was level with 60 grit, I smoothed it out in slow, steady passes, working up in grit from 80 to 120 to 150 and finally 220. I softened all the top and bottom edges with a small roundover bit on my router and lightly sanded the edges. This makes the top more pleasant to touch and protects it, as sharp edges are prone to damage. I also rounded the corners by hand sanding. And once I had recovered from many hours of sanding, I cleaned the dust off the top with a tack cloth. I began applying stain in the direction of the grain, working 2 to 3 board widths at a time. I applied 2 coats of stain about 5 hours apart to make sure I got uniform coverage of the whole surface. And as soon as I was done applying each coat of stain, I came back and wiped down the top with a clean cloth to remove any excess stain that hadn't absorbed into the wood grain. After letting the tabletop dry overnight, I applied 3 thin coats of polyurethane in the direction of the grain to the top using an oil-based finish brush. I only apply the poly in one direction here. I don't move the brush back and forth like I would with paint, as I've found that this can agitate it and create more air bubbles, which is undesirable. I had to move the tabletop inside after the first coat and onto the dining room table, because where else would you put your big woodworking project? It was just too humid in the shop and it wasn't drying. I lightly hand sanded between coats using 220 grit after the first coat and 320 after the second to knock down any of those high spots or air bubbles, and cleaned off the dust with a tack cloth each time. And then applied a fresh coat of poly after each sanding. I left it to dry for a minimum of 24 hours before moving it. And just some quick tips for using a non-disposable brush with polyurethane. I keep my brush wrapped in aluminum foil and in a Ziploc bag between coats so it doesn't dry out and become ruined. And when I'm done, I let my brush soak in mineral spirits that I apparently get everywhere in a metal soup can for about a day, and then wash it out and it's good to go. I'm using 3 of these drawer cabinets that I got from the particle board store as the base for the top, and I'm putting felt furniture pads at the 4 corners of each one to be a cushion for and to hold the top in place. I got some help to move the top up here and put it in place, as it's pretty heavy. Getting it by the door frame here proved to be quite the battle, but with our combined intelligence, we still took a pretty long time to figure out how to make it fit. But now it's in place and ready to be used. Brady and I are going to be using this as a crafting area, so the desk will be home to our sewing machine, vinyl cutter, yarn, and other crafting supplies. But when you make yours, you can use it however you see fit. And that's it, we are done making this tabletop. If you want to make one for yourself, all the tools and materials, as well as the free plans available on my website are linked down in the video description. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to give it a thumbs up. If you have any thoughts or questions, let me know down in the comments section. If you're not already a subscriber, consider doing that. And if you want to see more videos like this one, be sure to check out my other projects. Thanks for watching. Until next time, go build yourself.